going to look at David Hume and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. David Hume will, in fact, attempt to prove to us that it never happened. Sometimes I think that we forget that when we celebrate this resurrection, and when we tell people that we believe with all of our hearts that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, I think sometimes we forget that we are asking them to believe a pretty incredible thing. That's something to think that a man was buried in a tomb for 3 days and then rose from the dead. Not just spiritually, but physically. So maybe it does take something to look at what we celebrate and to believe it. Now, Sir David Hume was an 18th century Scottish philosopher, and I guess you could call him the cynic of all cynics. And he proposed that you could not prove the existence of any miracle, the existence of God, and in fact, you can't even prove your own existence. And there is no such thing as absolute right or wrong, because there's no basis for any proof about things like that. And so you just don't even have to worry about right or wrong. Now, that sounds a little strange and it sounds a little funny, but we also have to realize that ideas are very, very powerful. And Sir David Hume greatly influenced a man named Nietzsche, who laid the groundwork for the acceptance of the Nazi view of morality. And in a sense, he had kind of planted some seeds that developed to those that were able to embrace that position of survival of the fittest and survival of really the greatest race. Now, how I got involved with Sir David Hume is that for a little while I was working on a master's degree in philosophy. And I got actually 9 hours of credit towards that, including a full semester studying Sir David Hume. And then it dawned on me that nobody was coming to me with philosophical questions. They were coming to me with real problems, real issues. And so I wisely switched and got a master's degree in counseling, which has probably been a lot more beneficial. But during that period, I took this course from David Hume and came across an essay that he had written whereby he felt that he had totally disproved the possibility of the existence of God, the possibility of miracles, and so forth. And one of the arguments that was used back then in what was called natural theology to prove God existed was the argument from miracles. And the idea was, we know that miracles take place, and that gives us evidence that behind those miracles there is a miracle worker. So Hume felt that if he could attack the idea of miracles, that he would have taken away one of the very strongest arguments for the existence of God. Now, he approaches this essay with a great deal of confidence, maybe a bit over the top. This is what he writes as he starts to write this essay that's going to disprove the possibility of miracles. I flatter myself I have discovered an argument which will be an everlasting check to all kinds of superstitious delusions, all accounts of miracles and prodigies, sacred and profane. And so, in order to disprove miracles, he starts to talk about what it would actually take to prove a miracle. And he starts out by saying, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be as miraculous as, or more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. And then he begins to outline for us how much evidence he feels would be required to establish a miracle. All right? So we're going to go on his playing field and see what happens under his conditions in terms of the resurrection that we are celebrating this morning. First of all, first of the five, he states that in all of history, you cannot find a miracle which was witnessed by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusions in themselves. Second, he points out, the fact that so many miracles have proved to be frauds shows that we must be very suspicious of all such narratives. And third, those who purport to have seen miracles have been mostly ignorant and barbarous peoples. Fourth, all religions claim to have miracles, therefore they just cancel each other out. And then fifth, and this is the one that will take most of our attention today, Hume questions the historical veracity of sacred writings as opposed to records of historical events. And he says that not all writing should have equal force and authority. Now, it's going to be necessary to start with the fifth one, since that's where most of our testimony and information that we have about the resurrection of Jesus Christ takes place. So how do the four Gospels, the accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in terms of their account, how does that measure up in terms of what we would call legal historical proof? Now, when it comes to a miracle, and certainly with the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we are not looking for scientific proof. When somebody says you cannot prove, and if they mean scientifically, you cannot scientifically prove that Christ actually rose from the dead, they are absolutely correct. Because if you remember from your days of being taught these things, in order for something to be proved scientifically, you have to have very controlled conditions where you can have the same event checked over and over again. You have to be able to repeat the event under the same conditions and see if the same thing happens. Well, you certainly can't do that with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But the reality is that almost all of what we believe is not based on scientific proof. I can tell you where I was yesterday and what I was doing. There's no way that I can prove it to you scientifically. All I can do is give you historical evidence, which would be testimony of people that might have seen me, people that might have talked to me, and so forth. Being that in this particular situation we're in, Patty would be my only witness, might not be quite as strong, but still, that would be the only way I can prove it. I could not prove it scientifically. Can't repeat yesterday. And again, most of what you believe or don't believe, you are weighing the historical proof, not scientific proof. All right? So how do the Gospels then stack up in the area of legal historical evidence, which is what we're dealing with here with David Hume? Well, the truth is, they do fantastically. They hold up much better than what a lot of Christians and many atheists would expect. Now, what we're looking at to begin with is we look at what is called the bibliographical test, and that's an examination in how we got these historical documents. How did they come down to us? How reliable are the copies that we have? And what is the time interval between that copy and the original? And perhaps the best way for us to look at that is to look at some other historical documents which are absolutely assumed to be true by scholars, historians, and people that are educated in these things. So we're going to compare the New Testament manuscripts to some of the other writings. Again, Hume is challenging us on whether or not religious writings are worth looking at in terms of their truthfulness. All right, there's a volume called the History of Fluidities, and it is available to us. We have 8 manuscript copies, and they date about 900 AD, which is almost 1,300 years after this gentleman wrote. So you've got 8 copies, no originals. None of what we're looking at is the originals, including the New Testament. But you've got 8 copies, and the gap between when the fellow wrote and when the first copy is dated that we find. And what historian F.F. Bruce says is that no classical scholar would listen to an argument about the authenticity of these writings. All right, let's look at another. Aristotle wrote his Poetics, which you probably not read, around 343 BC. The earliest copy we have is AD 1100. That is a 1,400-year gap, and 5 manuscripts exist. Caesar wrote his History of the Gallic Wars between 58 and 60 BC. We have 10 copies dating 1,000 years after his death. So now let's look at the Gospels regarding the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Dr. Josh McDowell says this in terms of the New Testament writings. When it comes to the Manuscript Authority of the New Testament, the abundance of material is almost embarrassing in contrast. After early papyrus discoveries that bridged the gap between the time of Christ and the 2nd centuries, an abundance of other manuscripts came to light. We have over 20,000 copies of New Testament manuscripts that are in existence today. The closest other historical document that we have copies of is the Iliad, and we have 643. 20,000 of the New Testament, 643. And the date from the original to the first manuscripts, even if you take the more liberal view, is still less than 100 years. So you're comparing 20,000 copies, less than 100 years after the original, to those that maybe there's 5 copies 1,300 years later, and those are deemed by all historians to be acceptable, to be valid in terms of things like the Iliad. So in that area, the New Testament blows away any other historical document, including the testimony about the resurrection. Now, the internal evidence test is where you examine the document itself to see if there's any way in which it disqualifies itself as being authentic. In other words, does it contradict itself? Does it say one thing in one and another in an area? And despite over 2,000 years of people trying to find that and prove that, and you've probably had people tell you, well, the Bible is full of all kinds of contradictions. Well, ask them for one, because generally they have no idea. And so, despite the most skeptical examination, internally it's never been disqualified. The third and final is the external evidence test to see whether or not the documents confirm or deny the historical evidence of what it's claiming. In the Gospels, especially like with Luke, there are many references to historical data. Things like time, places, rulers, and other events. And none of them has ever been proven false by any other kind of archaeological historical discoveries. In fact, time and again, it ends up confirming that statement in the New Testament. So the fifth argument that he makes, that we should question, and there's no reason to accept religious writings, just doesn't hold up, because when you put the Gospels into that field, it makes up very well. Now, his first point regarding the need for the evidence for a miracle, and he says, there's not to be found in all of history any miracle attested to by a sufficient number of men on such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusions in themselves. Well, the New Testament claims that there were over 500 witnesses to the resurrected Christ. That should be a sufficient number by any account. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, talking about the resurrection and the appearance, speaking of Jesus, and he said, he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, and after that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain till now, though some have died. So Paul is not only claiming that more than 500 witnesses saw the resurrected Christ, but he goes on to say that most of them are still alive. If you don't believe me, go ask them. Okay? So 500 should be sufficient. Now what about their unquestioned good sense, education, and learning? A lot of people assume that the people of that day were sort of uneducated peasants. And that is simply not true. The fact is that one of their strongest ruling political parties, which you have heard of, the Sadducees, taught powerfully and widely and in all of their schools and in all of their religious teaching. The Sadducees taught that there is no such thing as the supernatural, there is no such thing as a spirit, and mocked the idea of life after death. So these people were raised in a culture where that was a very prevalent teaching by very educated people. Also, we know, of course, the teaching of the young people in that culture, particularly the boys, they were very well educated. And some of those that followed Jesus, there were women of financial substance, there were women of Herod's own household, there were tax collectors employed by the Roman government, there were a few highly educated members of the Pharisees actually became followers. So these miracles may abound chiefly among ignorant and barbarous people, as his third statement, but that does not apply to the group of people that are claiming that Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead. Well, what about their, what he says, their unquestioned good sense? Is there any way to show that these people were trustworthy? And we begin by looking at the price they paid for believing in this miracle. And if you look at the 11 apostles and James, the Lord's brother, these 12 men became the early leaders of the church. And 11 of them were killed because of their testimony that on the third day, Jesus rose from the dead. Now, it's true that a lot of people have died for a lie. But how many people have died for something that they actually knew was a lie? All any of them had to do at the moment of their execution would be to say, you got me, we made the whole thing up. And they would have been released. But none of them ever did. So we get to Hume's point about probabilities. Which is more probable, that they would die for what they knew was a lie, or that they died for what they knew was true? And how did they go on for decades, and not one of the 500, let alone the 12, ever broke under the pressure of this enormous hoax of over 500 witnesses? Pascal, the French philosopher, wrote this one at one point. The allegation that the apostles were impostors is quite absurd. If any one of these men had yielded to temptation so alluring, or given way to the compelling arguments of prison and torture, then all would have been lost. But none of them ever did. And if their entire message was based upon a lie, how do you explain the impact that it has? How do you explain that they personally condemned lying? They taught very high moral values. And in fact, in those early days of the church, even their enemies never tried to attack them on moral grounds. Well, the next possibility is it was all a delusion. That they weren't liars, it wasn't that they were delusional, they were hallucinating, that perhaps they wanted to believe it so badly that they that they just hallucinated, that they saw the resurrected Christ. And we kind of have to concede that that's possible. People do hallucinate. But again, in probability, what you have to look at is that St. Paul said 500 of the brethren saw him at one time, at once. Is it possible to have a mass hallucination of 500 people? And then you have all of the apostles' hallucinations, not once but several times over a period of 40 days. And that would be strong evidence for some serious mental and emotional instability. Let's face it, if you're hallucinating like that, something's up. But there's not one tiny shred of evidence that they had any mental or emotional illness, especially among the apostles. In fact, quite the opposite is found. They built the foundation for the strongest and most enduring organization in the history of the world. Several of them were public speakers who spoke with great clarity and power. They did not crack mentally, emotionally, under the pressure of their management responsibilities, their imprisonment, their torture, or even their execution. They lived as if they were totally sound mentally and emotionally. And note also, because it's a little strange, if it was a hoax, they claimed not to see the spirit of Jesus. They claimed to see his bodily resurrection. If you're going to do a hoax, why make it so difficult? The spirit would have been enough. Those people believed in spirits. That would have been the normal hallucination. Dr. Simon Greenleaf, who you may not know about, but he was one of the great legal minds that we've had in this country. In his American biography, it says, to the efforts of Story and other gentlemen, Story and Greenleaf, is ascribed the rise of the Harvard Law School to its eminent position among the legal schools of the United States. And while a professor at Harvard Law School, he examined the legal value of the apostles' testimonies regarding the resurrection of Christ. He stated that it was impossible that the apostles could have persisted in affirming the truths they had narrated had not Jesus actually risen from the dead, and had they not known this fact as certainly as they knew any other fact. Moving more quickly now, in Hume's second point, Counsel, countless of so-called miracles have been shown to be hoaxes. This one was not. There's never been a miracle in the history of the world that's come under such scrutiny, such attempts to disprove it. We did our usual thing yesterday, Easter thing. We watched Ben-Hur, and to be honest, we watched half of it on Thursday and the other half on Friday. The whole shot in one sometimes. Somehow just can't stay awake quite as easily as we used to. None of you know anything about that yet. But we watched it, and I was reminded, because obviously this has been in my mind too, the beauty of why that book and then that wonderful movie came about is because General Lew Wallace was asked by his associates, because he was also a writer as well as a Civil War general, would you please write a book that will prove once and for all that this whole stuff about Jesus Christ never happened, that he never rose from the dead, and that it was all just a hoax. And so Lew Wallace set out to write exactly that, and by the time he was done studying it and getting the background for his novel, he was totally convinced that it was true, that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead, and became a believer. And so out of that skepticism, we have that wonderful story and that wonderful testimony. The most basic thing, when you think about it, as we look at a little bit more at the evidence, all the Roman and Jewish leaders would have had to do to put an end to the story would have been to produce the body of Jesus Christ. And they never did. Yet, they claimed that they knew who had it. They knew that the disciples had taken the body. So all they had to do was to track them down and make a search, and they would have been able to find the body. Now, perhaps even more basic than that is that they could have made sure that they never lost the body in the first place. It would not be a surprise attack. They themselves said, we better do something because these guys are allowed to come and steal the body and say that he rose from the dead. So what they did, they went to Pilate and told him, we're afraid that the disciples are going to steal the body. And so in Matthew chapter 27, we read this. Therefore Pilate gave orders for the grave to be made secure until the third day, lest the disciples come and steal him away and say to the people, he is risen from the dead, and the last deception will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, you have a guard, which means I'm giving you, the word used there would have been 10 or 30 soldiers. He said, you have a guard, and go and make it as secure as you know how. The way that he made that statement and the trouble that he had in dealing with Jesus during the whole trial, I suspect in the back of his mind that he might have been wondering and might say, make it as secure as you can, because if it just happens, I think I'd like to know that it really happened. As he said to Jesus, what is truth? So they made it secure. First, a huge stone was placed over the opening to the tomb. It's spoken of as being exceedingly great. So anybody going to steal the body, it couldn't be a one-man mission. It probably had to be at least 3 or 4. Second, and this is probably most important, the tomb was sealed, and what that means is that it was hermetically sealed and nobody could get it open. What that meant was a Roman seal was placed upon the opening, and it was a fatal thing to do to break a Roman seal. Okay, that you could be executed for that. And so it was sealed with a Roman seal, which was not to be broken. And then again, they were given the Roman guard, a group of 10 to 30 soldiers, and they would have placed great importance upon the fact that if they let a Roman seal be broken on their watch, if they lost that body on that watch, they would be forfeiting their lives. And a Roman soldier knew that discipline. So historian G.W. Clark says this, so everything was done that human policy and prudence could be done to prevent the resurrection. With these very precautions, they had the most direct tendency to indicate and to establish it. In other words, all of this that they did to make sure it didn't happen helped to prove that it did happen. Somehow, the tomb became empty. So could a handful of fishermen, tax collectors, and the other women that were helping them, could they have overpowered the Roman guard and stolen the body? Even the rulers of the Pharisees didn't think so. In fact, what's interesting, if you read the gospel account, they didn't even question the story. All they did was bribe the soldiers that were there, rather than executing them, which is what was supposed to happen to them. They bribed them and paid them off and said, go out and tell them that the disciples came in and stole the body from us. Now what Roman soldier is going to go about admitting that a peasant had overpowered him in his duty, but maybe the money was, and saving their lives was enough to get them to do that. And again, another thing would have been to just get any one of those witnesses, any one of the 500, to admit it, and not a single one did. So we can totally agree with David Hume when he says we have good reason to expect that usually what we call miracles eventually are shown to be hoaxes or hallucinations. But this one never was. And so again, I'm going to quote David Hume himself as he speaks about a miracle. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be as miraculous as, or more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. Which is more miraculous? That 500 witnesses were able to maintain a hoax over their entire lifetime in face of imprisonment and torture in lieu of any attempts at bribery, or that they really believed what they were saying? Which is more miraculous? That these 500 had a mass hallucination, that the apostles had several joint hallucinations, and then went out and established a religion which became a vital part of the foundation of the Western world, or that it was all true? Which is a greater problem? That the Roman government and the Pharisees could not keep the body from being stolen, could not find it after it was stolen, and with all of its power could not break one witness, or that it really happens? Which is more miraculous? That this one event, perhaps the greatest claim of any miracle, has not been proven for the hoax that it is, despite centuries of scrutiny, investigation, attack, and countless re-examination, or that it did, in fact, happen? So once again, and finally, I quote David Hume. A man tells me he saw one dead restored to life. I ask myself, is it more probable that he should deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened? I weigh one miracle against the other and reject the greater. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then, but only until then, can he command my belief. John says about the writing of his gospel, these things are written in order that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life. Most of what I've shared is from a paper that I wrote in that class on David Hume. A paper that I handed in to a really wonderful professor who happened, by the way, to be Jewish. And he gave me an A+ on the paper. Now, that's all fine. And the A+, that was wonderful. But belief in the facts isn't enough. It helps. It helps to realize that we're not foolish for believing in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It helps to deal with those who simply dismiss it as a hoax or something like that. But no one can really know until they test this out for themselves in terms of what Jesus said as he declared, I am the way, the truth, and the life. As he talked about the fact that whoever comes to me will never be thirsty. As John writes, that those that receive him, then he gave the power to become the children of God. And in Revelation 3:20, where Jesus, speaking metaphorically at the door of our hearts, says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. And if anyone will open the door and invite me to come in, I will have incredible fellowship with him. In fact, the greatest way in that culture to say it, we'll have a meal together. It'll be fantastic. The facts are there. And anybody that seriously wants to investigate whether the thing, as C.S. Lewis said, if the thing happened, it was the most important event in history. If you want to find out if the thing happened, then there's a lot to be looked at. But the final thing is knowing in your own heart and in your own life, not only that he is risen, but that he is in the here and now. He's here today. And those that open their hearts to him will come to know this resurrected Lord, this one who loved us so much, that he was willing to give his life for us on the cross, that we might come back into a wonderful relationship with Jesus Christ. And even on this Easter Sunday morning, that can be the time when we decide, I really want to know. I really want to find out. And the way to find out is to, whatever faith you've got, Lord, if you're there, come into my heart, I really want to know you. Let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for this amazing miracle. We were lost. We had gone our own way. And you loved us so much you never gave up. And you sent your one and only begotten Son to live, to tell us about faith, to tell us about hope, to tell us about life, to tell us about the incredible foundation and importance of love, and then to demonstrate it by giving your life for us in our place on the cross. Lord, thank you for that. And may we open our hearts to you anew and thank you for this wonderful day, this wonderful celebration. In Jesus' name.